All right. I think now's a good time to get started. My name is Christian Clark. As many of you know, I'm the Utah Main Street Coordinator, and this is our Utah Main Street webinar series, where we present educational and learning material and try to help each other learn and develop our Main Street programs. Today's webinar series will be by Jansen Bennett, our SHPO historic architect. He's part of our Main Street team. We work together a lot on our Main Street projects, and he'll be giving us a presentation on the standards and introduction to the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. And with that, I'll let Jansen take over.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the standards. So if you have worked with SHPO on any remodel or facade project or anything, you have probably heard us reference the standards. And so today, the goal is that you will be able to kind of know what we are referring to when we refer to that. We will start with a brief historical context of how the standards came to be and how we came to be involved with the standards. We'll also kind of look at an overview of the different projects that the standards kind of can be applied to. And then we'll dive into kind of a more in-depth discussion about the standards for rehabilitation, which are the most widely used because they cover a variety of project types. So without further ado, let's get into the historical context. So in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was passed by Congress. And this is important because not only does it kind of place an emphasis within the United States on historic preservation and kind of establish a more concerted effort among preservationists, but it also sets up a grants in aid program. And it also says that the National Park Service should both maintain and establish the National Register of Historic Places. It says that the grant and aid program can be used for those properties, and also tasks the Secretary of the Interior by means of the Park Service to establish preservation standards to determine whether a project should or should not receive grant funding. So it takes a while, a solid 7 years, for the policies and procedures to be released for the Grants and Aid program, which is 2 years after the Grants and Aid program is actually established in 1971. So those first 2 years must have been great. It wasn't until, the Grants and Aid policies and procedures were a good first step, but they weren't applicable to lots of project types. So any kind of remodel project wasn't covered by it. So in 1976, the guidelines for rehabilitating old buildings was released in addition to preservation project standards. Now, the guidelines for rehabilitating old buildings, together with the Grants and Aid policies and procedures, were meant exclusively for the Grants and Aid program, whereas the preservation project standards were meant for the Department of Housing and Urban Development to use. Also in 1976, the Tax Reform Act is passed by Congress, which adds another program that meets preservation standards. So with 3 different kind of programs administered by different people and departments, it became clear that there should be one single set of standards that can be applied to all different project types. So that comes out in 1979 with the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Historic Preservation Projects. Now, since 1979, these standards have been revised and updated multiple times, with the most recent being in 2017 with the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, with guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing historic buildings. So each of these updates have included more guidelines, added kind of technological updates, etc. 2017 is the most recent one and is the one I'll be discussing today. So within the standards, there are 4 different treatment types or project types for historic properties. First is preservation, which seeks to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of an historic property. So preservation is usually dealing primarily with stabilization and potentially some repairs. But the kind of overarching goal of preservation projects is to make sure that what is there doesn't continue to deteriorate or fall down, but it doesn't seek to really update anything. So the next project type is rehabilitation, which looks to make possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving its historical, cultural, or architectural values. So rehabilitation is focused primarily on making sure that a historic building can be used and that the new use won't destroy the historic character of the building. So all repairs, alterations, additions, remodel projects fall very easily into rehabilitation standards. The next one is restoration, which looks to accurately depict a property as it appeared at a particular period of time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. So one key difference between rehabilitation projects and restoration projects is that rehabilitation is concerned more with the current use and conserving the history, the historical fabric from a period of significance. Restoration looks not at the new use, but at making sure that the building or historic property looks exactly like it did at a specific date or period. And so that means that you can't add any new features. You want paint colors to match exactly, kind of very nitty-gritty details, making sure that a restoration project looks exactly the way it did at a historical point in time. Reconstruction projects look to accurately depict, by means of new construction, a non-surviving property for the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period of time and in its historical site. So a reconstruction is essentially a restoration project of a building that no longer exists for whatever reason. Often we see reconstruction projects as part of, like, there were lots after World War II in Europe, where lots of historical and cultural landmarks were completely destroyed and then rebuilt based on historic plans and with an effort to make it look exactly the way it did before it was destroyed. So, of course, restoration, reconstruction are kind of very detailed and very tricky to execute correctly. So the majority of projects we deal with are rehabilitation projects. So the remainder of this presentation will focus primarily on rehabilitation and what each of those standards are, as well as examples of projects that meet and do not meet the standards. I want to start with just a quick note, a little preface. So just because a project meets the standards does not mean that it's well designed, that it's functional, that it looks really great. Likewise, there are lots of well-designed, functional, really great rehabilitation projects that don't meet the standards. So an overarching goal that we should all have is that the projects we undertake are both well-designed, they look good and are functional, while also meeting the standards and ensuring that the historic fabric is preserved to the greatest extent possible. To help us, I've recruited the help of our friend Ron Swanson, who, when a project meets the standards, you will see this this pleases me GIF, which means that Ron approves and the project meets the standards. If a project does not meet the standards, we'll get the disapproval face. So just so you know. Diving into the standards, Standard 1 states that a property will be used as it was historically, or be given a new use that requires minimal change to its distinctive materials, features, spaces, and spatial relationships. In other words, we want the new use to match the historic building. So usually the easiest way to make sure that a new use matches a historic building is to continue the same use. So if it's a single family residence and was a single family residence historically, keep a single family residence now. If it was a commercial retail building, make sure it's a commercial retail building now. But that isn't always possible. So I'll give a few examples of projects, new uses that don't match, as well as an example of a use that does match. So what you see on the left is an ice storage house or building from the Northeast that dates back to the late 19th century. Now, we have freezers, we have refrigerators, some people have ice makers, we don't need an ice storage house. So a proposed project looks to use the historic building and put in multifamily housing. Unfortunately, that use would require the kind of addition of lots of openings, as well as they wanted to put in balconies. Now, none of those things are in keeping with the historic character or features of the historic building. And so it's not a good match and doesn't meet this standard. Similarly, this is a jail from the 1880s, and a project proposed to put in multifamily housing within the exterior shell of the jail. However, to do that, they would have to remove all of the cell block, which, standards aside, the cell block was the structural element of the building. And so it wasn't very wise to just be like, hey, we're going to gut the building. Also, the new construction would remove the spatial relationship of all of the small cell blocks in comparison with the larger cells on the left side of the plan. So it also was not a good match and does not meet the standard. We can compare those two examples with this project, which looks to put a bookshop within an 18th century church. And looking at the plan, you can see that the new construction is fairly limited to this area right here. They aren't touching the exterior shell of the building or any of the interior spaces. So they aren't modifying any spatial relationships or looking to modify any of the finishes or historic features of the building. They did need to remove a small portion of the floor in order to support that new construction. But in the end, the project kind of maintained all of the historic features and relationship of space while promoting a new and very different use from the historic use. And Ron approves. It meets all of the standards. Moving on to Standard 2. Standard 2 states the historic character of a property will be retained and preserved. The removal of distinctive materials or alteration of features, spaces, and spatial relationships that characterize a property will be avoided. In other words, there's no going back. Once you have removed historic fabric or a historic spatial relationship, you can't go back. You've changed it forever. So, looking at this building, which is a historically commercial retail building on the left, the proposed project looked to remove the commercial storefront and replace it with 3 smaller openings. So this breaks kind of the standard in 2 different ways. First, it removes the historic materials and doesn't seek to replace them with similar materials. So removes the historic fabric and doesn't replace it with anything similar. Secondarily, it also removes something that defines the building as a commercial building and replaces it with smaller residential sized openings. So it confuses the kind of historic nature of the building. It looks, instead of a commercial building, like a residential building and doesn't meet the standards. Another example is the addition of a roof garden on top of these 2 historic commercial buildings. Now, there's nothing wrong with roof gardens in and of themselves, but because it's clearly visible from the street, it removes a key spatial relationship where the roof would not have been accessible historically. And if so, it definitely would not have been a roof garden. So it does not meet the standard. However, this project does meet the standards while adding a roof garden. You can see that they have held back all of the plantings from the perimeter of the building, as well as limited the location of the trees on the roof garden to the very center of the building, so it's not visible from the street. And in doing so, it maintains that relationship, the historic relationship from the roof to the building, and it meets the standards. So moving on to standard number 3. Standard 3 states that each property will be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or elements from other historic properties, will not be undertaken. In other words, we don't want to lie about the history of our buildings. The way that this standard is most often broken is by wanting to make a building look more historic by adding features, typically like trim work or ornamentation, that may not have ever existed. And so we don't want to kind of give that false sense of history. Another example on a downtown commercial building is this one that, like the previous example, removed the commercial storefront, replaced it with residential-sized openings, which already kind of lies about what the historic use of the building was. And number 2, you can see in lots of the detailing with the gabled awning, the kind of keystone elements above the windows, it looks too historic. You can't tell where the historic fabric ends and where the new construction begins. And so it makes it look like the new construction was original to the building and doesn't meet the standards. Another interesting kind of nuance with this standard is this project. The building on the left was built in the early 20th century, but was planned and designed to have 2 additional floors above this cornice line. The property owner still had the original plans, and the proposed project involved building the additional 2 upper floors according to the original plans. However, because the building, those two upper floors were never built historically and were built exactly according to the plans, it makes it look like the entire building was built in the early 20th century. And instead of having it be evident that the two upper floors were built 80 years after the rest of the building. So because it gives that false sense of history, it does not meet the standards. So moving on to Standard 4. Standard 4 states that changes to a property that have acquired historic significance in their own right will be retained and preserved. In other words, we need to recognize that all portions of a building's history are significant. You can't pick and choose which additions or which portions of a building are historically significant or not. For this example, this is a mausoleum in Ogden that was recently sent to the National Park Service for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. In its nomination form, the period of significance goes from its construction in the late 1920s through the mid-1970s. And that period of significance includes this entryway addition to the mausoleum. The addition was done in the early 1970s and is very characteristic of the 1970s. It has a fairly plain, very simple and modern line, as well as kind of the gabled roof. And if the property owner were to propose removing that addition and reverting the building back to its original kind of appearance in the 1920s, it would not meet the standard because it's removing a significant portion of the building's history. So this standard essentially says that we want to make sure that we keep and preserve all of a building's kind of iterations throughout its timeline. Standard 5 states that distinctive materials, features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property will be preserved. In other words, details matter. We want to make sure that all of the distinctive or character-defining features of a building are maintained and kept throughout its life. So this project that looked at removing the plasterwork to expose the brick behind, while it looks good aesthetically, it does not meet the standards because it removes, it removes a distinctive material and finish from the project. And Ron disapproves. Standard 6 says that deteriorated historic features will be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old in design, color, texture, and, where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features will be substantiated by documentary and physical evidence. So our goal is to fix it rather than replace it. And sometimes a material is so damaged or so deteriorated that repairing it isn't possible, in which case we want to make sure that the replacement matches the historic feature as closely as possible, down to color, texture, material. So also, we want to make sure that anything we put back on a building, if we want it to look historic, we need to make sure that there's documentary evidence of that feature. So you can, for example, we often look to historical photographs or to, if you're lucky enough to have original like construction drawings of a building, and a feature is shown in one of those things, then we can replicate that feature, even if it's not existing. Our examples include this building that was a late 19th century factory. And you can see it in the existing or construction photo that they've removed all of the steel windows that had deteriorated, but were also a character defining feature. The new proposed design and construction replaces all of those with very contemporary windows, which, while they look amazing, don't meet the standard because they aren't matching what was there historically. And Ron disapproves. You can compare that project with this commercial office building that has tons of windows. Historically, they were all steel, like the steel windows with some operable parts. Now, instead of replacing all of them wholesale when the windows had become deteriorated, they did an inventory and looked at each individual window and decided which ones could be repaired and which ones needed to be replaced. In addition to repairing all of the ones that were only slightly damaged or where the damage could be repaired, they got new aluminum windows that matched the existing windows as much as possible. And so you can see here that they looked at the historic window and then looked at how they could make and replicate all of those profiles and all of those details, usually by adding additional pieces that didn't come standard with the window. So you can see here, they added a stepped muntin or a piece of aluminum to replicate a stepped muntin. They made the places where a window would have been operable thicker, even though all of the new windows were fixed and weren't going to be operable. They made sure it looked thicker, like that was an operable sash. And it went down into such detail as to every single piece of glazing was sized appropriately. This is cutting vertically through one of the muntins or divisions between two panes of glass. And they put in an additional extruded aluminum piece to make it look like there was glazing putty. They replicated this profile, looking at if you were to cut vertically through the window, they made sure that they replicated the drip cap where it would have been, that would have allowed water to go away from the operable portion of the sash. And they went into all of these details and made sure that it matched as closely as possible, even though they weren't using the original material. And in the end, you can't tell which of these windows is a replacement and which of them were repaired. So it was an incredibly successful project that pleases Ron very much. Standard 7 looks at what treatments we apply to our building for cleaning, etc. And it says that chemical or physical treatments, if appropriate, will be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Treatments that cause damage to historic materials will not be used. It's for this In other words, we want to be kind to our historic materials. We don't want to do anything that causes damage over the lifetime of the materials. It's for this reason that we advise against sandblasting brick. Although it looks great initially, you can see on the left that the outer hardest surface of the brick has been damaged.
Yeah.
And is pockmarked.
This guy, Kenny Parcell,
and
he's from Utah.
Is pockmarked and will deteriorate relatively quickly. Similarly, we recommend against using hardware store mortar to repoint or replace damaged mortar because it has a higher content of Portland cement, which is harder chemically than both the historic mortar and the historic brick, and results in the historic brick spalling or crumbling and deteriorating. So in order to meet the standards, we don't want to apply any of these chemical treatments. Now, I do just want to say before we move on to the next standard that it can be really tricky to know which treatments are and are not appropriate. I have my contact information listed at the end of this webinar, and please feel free to reach out. You can reach out with any product information, you can give me a call, and I'm happy to help you kind of sort out whether a treatment is appropriate or not, as well as an appropriate alternative if it isn't. Standard 8 deals with archaeological resources and says the archaeological resources will be protected and preserved in place. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures will be undertaken. The simplest way to deal with archaeological resources is to just don't touch them. Now, occasionally you have to. And I am not qualified at all, really, to discuss archaeological artifacts or resources. So if you're doing a project, you're digging, and you come across any archaeological artifacts, such as nails, really old beer bottles, pottery, etc., feel free to reach out to our public archaeologist, Elizabeth Hora, and she can help you know what next steps should be taken. Similarly, if you're digging and you find human remains, especially bones, etc., first contact local law enforcement just to make sure nothing fishy is going on. And then feel free to reach out to Dorina Kopp, who is our Human Remains Program lead, and she'll be able to advise you on next steps. However, if you are receiving grant funding, either from federal or state funds, please contact SHPO immediately, as there are more stringent requirements for if you're receiving government funding. So feel free to reach out. Please contact us immediately if you're receiving grant funding. Both Standard 9 and Standard 10 deal with additions to historic properties. So Standard 9 states that new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. The new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale, and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property and its environment. So that's a lot, but essentially it boils down to two things. One, we don't want to hurt the historic building. Number two, we want to make sure that what we're putting on the historic building is a little bit different. We don't want it to look like it existed with the building from its construction. So we want it to be a little bit different, but still compatible with the building. I want to show this example, which adds onto a historic bungalow in Australia. And the proposed plan does lots of things really, really well. You can see that the new addition is placed on the least visible part of the property. So this is the front, the view from the street. It's placed at the rear. It's also much smaller than the rest of the building. So it gives the historic building the prominence, and then in its height and scale, make sure that it is less important, more diminutive than the historic building. It also does a few additional things that are really awesome. It maintains some of the lines. So you can see that from this front porch, that line for this portion of the building is the same. It pays homage to the building while not replicating the building. It also includes what preservationists call a hyphen, or I learned it as a gasket. So a little portion of the new addition that separates the key distinctive features of the new addition from the historic building. It also uses similar materials, in this case, wood, and on the kind of very back portion, it uses siding, similar to the existing materials, but different enough that you can tell it isn't original to the building. So it does lots of things to make sure that it's different from the building, it doesn't look historic, and it's still compatible in design and size and massing with the historic property. And it meets all of those standards. This project adds on to an old slaughterhouse, which is kind of cool. But you can see that unlike the previous project, the new addition is very, very large and almost kind of domineers or overpowers the historic building in its size and also in kind of its location. So even though it's set back from the historic building, it is so large that it doesn't really play nicely. However, they did do some things right. I really like the material choice for this addition because it is a new product. It's a rain screen system. So instead of having being constructed of massive stone block, it is just little thin sheets of stone, but it matches really, really well while still being differentiated. But because of its massing and location, it doesn't meet the standards. Like I said, Standard 10 also deals with new additions, as well as adjacent or related new construction. It says new additions and adjacent or related new construction will be undertaken in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. So we want to make sure that whatever we do could be removed. There are a few different reasons for this. One, as you add on to a property, making sure that something could be removed is a really good way to make sure that you aren't hurting the historic material. So by following Standard 10, you ensure that you're following Standard 9. However, it is also important so that if anyone ever wants to do a restoration project where you are restoring a building back to a date and time, you can do that. You can remove the addition and still have essentially the same historic property in all of its integrity. One example here is this addition onto two historic buildings. Now, the historic building had kind of a very layered and storied life of its own. It was most recently a theater. And so you can see this portion is older, this is newer, but both are date to the early 20th century or earlier. The new construction does a few things really well. It is set back and distinguished from the historic properties, although it's still a little too overpowering to really meet Standard 9. Where it doesn't meet Standard 10, however, is where on the side it removed historic material in order to make room for a new addition. And so if anyone ever wanted to go back to the original buildings, they wouldn't be able to do so. Therefore, it does not meet the standards. However, this new addition does meet the standards. You can see here how the new addition is really just kind of like butt up against the historic building. And so if anyone ever wanted to remove this addition, they could remove all of the glassy part and still have the historic building without much damage to the historic building. Usually, like in this one, they have made sure that all of the nails that are used to fasten the new materials to the historic materials are in are in mortar joints. And so the mortar is easily repairable. You can remove the new addition and then repair the historic fabric without any issue. Another way that Standard 10 can usually be followed is if you are making a new addition to the interior, to keep what historic materials you're moving. So say you need to expand a stair or anything, keeping things like railings, other trim work, etc., and keeping that as attic stock or basement stock is another way that you can kind of work toward fulfilling Standard 10. So this meets the standards. In conclusion, I want to just kind of say that the standards are often very broad, and it can be really confusing to know how they should be applied to a specific instance. The best way to kind of get a read on whether you're following the standards or not is to consult with someone who has studied the standards extensively. In this case, you are welcome to contact me. I'm happy to discuss projects. I kind of geek out over the standards, so it's really fun for me. I love discussing the projects. So here's my contact information. You can also contact Christian, and he can direct you to me or another staff member who is familiar with the standards. I also have links here to the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which is a web resource. You can read through the standards. They also have a few other resources from that same page, such as the National Park Service Preservation by Topic, where if you want to say you're working on windows, you can go to the Windows section and they will give you resources on knowing how to best follow the standards while replacing or repairing windows. Similarly with HVAC, plumbing, electrical, doors, floors, you can look for it. They have almost everything there. So with all of that, it was kind of a really quick overview of all of the standards. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So Jansen, you have a couple in the Q&A.
Great.
Jared, you can see that.
All right.
I copied those into the chat, so
okay.
Just can see it. Can't see the Q&A.
So Jared asked, what are the consequences for not meeting the standards? He said, my understanding is that it would remove a building from eligible listing on the National Register and negate the option for historic tax credits. Alina provided a really good response. So if you change a building drastically, like most of the examples I showed, I would consider a drastic change that would result in the building being removed from the National Register. So that's kind of a worst case scenario. The other big consequence that results if you are getting any grant funding, all of our grant programs, as well as any federal grant programs, require you to meet these standards. So whether it's Utah SHPO, any federal program, you're required to meet those standards. If you don't meet them, you don't get the funding. Similarly with tax credits. So that's a big kind of consequence. as far as consequences are concerned, I also just want to say, and granted, I'm very biased, but oftentimes the preservation standards, even though they were developed in the United States for federal projects, they are a pretty good guideline for just doing good preservation work. And so preserving a building and making sure it meets the standards is a good way to make sure that we have our historic fabric and that the buildings maintain its historic character for future generations. So it's kind of a consequence if not following the standards, but it's not as immediate as losing funding or having it delisted from the register.
Thanks, Jen. That helps. Yeah, my second question, about graffiti removal on historic Adobe brick actually comes from one of our members of our Downtown Alliance and
awesome.
Just one of our building owners, really, that we were talking about last week at our meeting. So I'm interested in this, and I'll be able to pass information along too.
Yeah. So graffiti removal is fun.
And just to clarify, it's not painted right now, right? The brick is not painted. And
so you said
the theory was, well, I haven't covered up the graffiti to paint it because I feel like I shouldn't paint the brick, right? Which is good, but
yes, that is exactly what we want to hear. So there are a few products that can be used. I can send those to you. Also, the standards say that we should use the gentlest means possible. So typically that is a natural bristle brush, water, and time, which isn't really reassuring or comforting. But if you scrub brick long enough with a natural bristle brush or kind of a softer plastic brush, eventually it will remove the graffiti, especially if it's unfired Adobe. It will come off. There are a few other methods you can use, such as poulticing, which is where you apply a chemical treatment or even just water to a piece of cloth, and then you put it on the building and let it dry. And then that cloth and the chemical treatment or water kind of soaks up lots of the graffiti, or it also works really well for biological growth or dirt. And so that's another option. If you want to send me pictures of the damage as well as the brick, I am happy to advise kind of more in depth. But those are two treatment options that work really well.
Could you say what the name of that second one was one more time?
So it's a poultice.
Okay.
And so the National Park Service also has preservation briefs where they take like a specific problem and write like a 3 to 10 page paper on how to solve it while adhering to all the standards. There is a really great one on removing graffiti and cleaning masonry that I can send you as well. Okay, I will note that down.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jensen, we have a few more, two more in the chat. Some good questions in the chat, one from Allison Anderson and one from Tyson Hamilton.
Okay, would you mind reading those out to me?
Yes. So Allison says, we are beginning the process of rehabilitating a 1916 junior high school in Spring City. In the 1950s, opaque fiberglass were used to replace the original paned windows. They're yellowed, hideous, and out of conformity to the original designs. However, they've now been there a long time. Your thoughts?
All right. So I can tell you this. So I will answer your question, I promise. But there are a few standards at play here. And technically speaking, none of the standards take precedence over another. So opaque fiberglass, yes, it probably has taken on significance in its own right now. However, you can look first to the nomination form or find out how long the original glass was there versus the opaque fiberglass. Also, so when you look there, you can see kind of which one has been there longer. There is nothing wrong with replacing the glazing if you have precedent for what's there. So if you can find a good historical photograph or the floor plans of the original building, and you can find out how the original windows looked, you can replace them with a new window that looks as close to the historic window as possible. I wouldn't recommend this, but if you were involved in a grant in a tax credit project, for example, or a federal project, then you may need to replace the fiberglass with fiberglass. Not ideal. And I would have a hard time seeing the National Park Service requiring that. But they have done weirder things. So I would say start by trying to find a historic photograph of the windows or the original plans. Sometimes for big, public institutional buildings like schools, your county or city will have them in their archives. It's not always the case, but it's a good place to start. If not, definitely look for photographs and try to replicate the windows as close to possible with what was there originally is a pretty good place to start.
Thank you. The next question from Tyson is, just as long as the building isn't modified at all, we're okay. I'm getting ready to update the HVAC in my building this spring.
Yes. So with things like HVAC, oftentimes an update will include a kind of minor update will include replacing the equipment. There's nothing wrong with replacing the equipment with a new updated system. So for air conditioning, it's usually a condenser. For heating, sometimes you're replacing a boiler with a furnace or an older furnace with a new furnace. Both of those options are totally fine. Where it gets a little bit trickier is if you are replacing ductwork or if you need to kind of reroute ductwork. So in that instance, if you're rerouting ductwork, we would look at things like, how is the ductwork being moved to where it needs to be? What damage will be done to historic fabric? How can you distinguish any new mechanical chases from the work around it, etc. But if you aren't making any changes besides swapping out the equipment, you're fine, and you will meet all the standards.
Okay, I don't have any more questions here, but I had a comment about I can't remember the number of the standard, but the standard where you discuss the mausoleum, right? Yeah. Where some people, like, sometimes an addition can seem to be not that great or a really bad idea, but it's become historic. Kind of like the fiberglass windows, but in some cases there's bigger additions that have become historic but were not a good idea. And I'm not saying this one necessarily is like that, but this is what triggered the comment. And what can be done in those cases? Can you just comment on that? Like, if there's an addition that has kind of become historic, or even a bad addition that may not be as historic, what are your options for changing things? Like in this case, if they removed that, they would be breaking the standard.
Yeah, very clearly breaking the standard.
And they would lose their National Register status.
Potentially, yes. So this one is one of the more controversial standards, but it's there for really good reasons. So we in the present are often a really bad judge of what will be valued in the future. For example, last year I went on kind of a horror novel haunted house binge, And I read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, which is a good book, by the way. But in that book, there is a full 2-page description about how awful Victorian architecture is. Like, it calls it gaudy, the worst architectural style for residences. Like 2-page diatribe about how awful it is. But now those are like, everyone like widely loves Victorian architecture now. So we in the present are a really bad judge of what will be valued in the future. Also, we don't want to kind of tell the lie of a building. So in rehabilitation projects, we want to make sure that the building is a true representation of the entirety of its history. If you are doing a restoration project, for example, if this mausoleum wanted to be restored to its original design in 1929, then they would look at everything. Any windows, the addition, anything that had been changed since 1929, they would go through and remove them. And they would reconstruct what was there. So that is totally fine for a restoration project, but not for a rehabilitation project. So those are kind of your two options. If you really, really, really want to remove an addition that has kind of taken on its own historical significance, then you might want to choose a restoration project. I will say it's really hard to get to like tick all the boxes of a restoration project. Also, kind of setting all that aside, if an addition is less than 50 years old and is not like included within the period of significance on your historic property, you're probably okay to remove it, because the arbitrary rule set forth by the Park Service, if it's less than 50 years old, it isn't considered historic. But sometimes, like in this instance, the addition is included even though it's 48 years old. So if it is seen as significant on the National Register nomination form, then don't touch it. Try to conserve it. If it is not within the period of significance, you can probably remove it, but be very careful not to do any damage to the earlier fabric. When you're removing an addition, I would appreciate being consulted, just because sometimes additions impact historic fabric in ways that aren't like evident just looking at it. So I'm happy to take a look and let you know my thoughts on a case-by-case basis as well. I hope that answered the comment/question.
I think so. I think it did. All right. I think I don't have any more questions in the chat or the Q&A before we're now at 1:04, so it's about time to be done. Are there any more questions before we close? Thank you so much, Jansen. That was a great presentation. It was a lot of fun. I love all the Ron Swanson. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
you, everyone.